The summer of 1881 burned across the Arizona Territory with relentless fury, turning the desert landscape into a furnace that tested the endurance of every living creature. 14-year-old Thomas "Tommy" Mackenzie wiped the sweat from his brow as he guided his father's cattle through the narrow passages of Devil's Canyon, a treacherous stretch of rock formations and hidden springs that provided the only reliable water source for miles around their isolated ranch. Tommy had been making this journey alone for 2 years now, ever since his father's leg injury had made the difficult ride impossible for anyone but the most agile horseman. The boy possessed an intuitive understanding of the harsh desert terrain that impressed even the most experienced ranchers in the territory, navigating routes that would challenge grown men with decades of frontier experience. The Mackenzie Ranch sat precariously on the edge of Apache territory, in a region where tensions between white settlers and native tribes had been escalating for months. Recent raids on neighboring homesteads had left everyone on edge, but the Mackenzies had little choice but to continue their operations. The ranch represented their entire life savings and their only means of survival in an unforgiving landscape. "Easy, copper," Tommy murmured to his buckskin gelding as the horse picked its way carefully down a steep, rocky slope. The cattle followed with the patient resignation of animals accustomed to difficult terrain, their bells creating a gentle melody that echoed off the canyon walls. It was the absence of that familiar sound that first alerted Tommy to danger. The cattle had stopped moving, bunching together in the nervous formation they adopted when sensing predators or other threats. Copper's ears pricked forward, and the horse's muscles tensed beneath Tommy, in the way that signaled immediate caution was required. Following his mount's alert gaze, Tommy spotted something that made his blood run cold: a riderless Apache warhorse standing motionless beside a cluster of desert willows near the canyon's only spring. The animal bore the distinctive markings and gear that marked it as belonging to a warrior of high status, and its presence in this remote location could only mean serious trouble. Tommy's first instinct was to turn around immediately and ride for home as fast as Copper could carry him. Every settler child in the territory had been raised on stories of Apache raids and the fate that awaited those unlucky enough to encounter hostile war parties. But something about the scene struck him as wrong. The horse stood too still, showing none of the alertness that would characterize an animal whose rider was nearby and active. Dismounting carefully, Tommy approached the spring with the cautious movements his father had taught him for navigating potentially dangerous situations. What he discovered among the willows changed everything he thought he understood about courage, loyalty, and the complex relationships that defined life on the frontier. An Apache warrior lay unconscious beside the water, his dark skin pale with blood loss from a severe wound in his left shoulder. The man's breathing was shallow and labored, and his war paint had been streaked by sweat and the efforts of what appeared to be a desperate attempt to reach the life-giving spring. Despite his youth and limited experience, Tommy could see that without immediate medical attention, this man would not survive another day in the desert heat. The rational part of Tommy's mind screamed warnings about the danger of approaching a wounded Apache warrior. This could be a trap, a test, or simply a situation that would result in his death regardless of his intentions. But looking at the unconscious man's face, Tommy saw not a fearsome enemy but a human being in desperate need of help. The warrior appeared to be in his 30s, with the lean build and weathered features of someone who had spent his entire life in harsh desert conditions. His clothing and weapons marked him as a person of importance within his tribe, possibly even a chief or war leader. The quality of his horse's gear and the intricate details of his own equipment suggested someone with significant status and respect among his people. Tommy knelt beside the wounded man, drawing on everything his mother had taught him about treating injuries before consumption had claimed her life 3 years earlier. The shoulder wound appeared to be from a rifle bullet, probably sustained in a skirmish with soldiers or settlers somewhere to the south. The fact that the warrior had managed to travel this far while seriously injured spoke to remarkable physical strength and determination. "Jesus," Tommy whispered, using his knife to cut away the blood-soaked leather around the wound. "What am I supposed to do with you?" The question hung in the desert air like a prayer, because Tommy Mackenzie was about to make a decision that would change not only his own life, but the delicate balance of power and conflict that defined the entire Arizona Territory. Chapter 2. An Act of Mercy. Tommy worked through the blazing afternoon heat, with the focused determination of someone who understood that a man's life hung in the balance of his actions. Using skills his late mother had taught him and techniques he'd learned from treating injured cattle, he carefully cleaned the Apache warrior's wound with precious water from his canteen, tearing strips from his own shirt to create makeshift bandages. The warrior remained unconscious throughout Tommy's ministrations, his breathing gradually becoming more stable as the boy managed to stop the worst of the bleeding. Working in the shade of the desert willows, Tommy could see that his patient was indeed a man of considerable importance. The intricate silver work on his weapons and the quality of his leather goods spoke to high rank within Apache society. "You're one of their chiefs, aren't you?" Tommy murmured as he secured the final bandage. "Pa's gonna tan my hide if he finds out about this, but I can't just let you die out here." The practical challenges of the situation were overwhelming. Tommy couldn't leave the wounded man alone in the desert, but he also couldn't abandon his family's cattle or stay away from the ranch long enough to ensure proper medical care. After considerable deliberation, he made a decision that required both courage and calculated risk. Using the Apache's own horse and his remarkable strength for someone so young, Tommy managed to get the unconscious warrior draped securely across the animal's back. He then drove the cattle toward a hidden box canyon that his father had shown him years earlier. A natural enclosure with good grass and a reliable spring that could hold livestock safely for several days. The journey to the hidden canyon took the rest of the afternoon, with Tommy constantly checking on his unconscious charge while managing the cattle and watching for signs of other Apache warriors who might be searching for their missing leader. By the time he had the livestock safely enclosed and the wounded man transferred to a more comfortable resting place among some sheltered rocks, the sun was beginning to set behind the western mountains. Tommy built a small, smokeless fire, using techniques his father had learned during his years as an army scout, then heated water to clean the wound more thoroughly. As he worked, the Apache warrior began to show signs of returning consciousness, his eyes fluttering open to focus slowly on the boy who had saved his life. The moment of recognition was electric with tension. The warrior's hand moved instinctively toward his knife, before his weakened condition reminded him of his vulnerable position. His dark eyes studied Tommy with the intense concentration of someone trying to understand an impossible situation. "Easy," Tommy said quietly, keeping his hands visible and his movements calm. "You've been shot pretty bad. I've done what I can to help, but you need real medical attention." The Apache spoke in his native language, his voice weak but clearly questioning. When Tommy shook his head to indicate he didn't understand, the man switched to heavily accented but comprehensible English. "You help me. White boy, help Apache." "You were dying," Tommy replied simply. "I couldn't just ride away and let that happen." The warrior studied Tommy's face with the intensity of someone trying to read character and motivation in unfamiliar territory. "What is your name, white boy?" "Tommy Mackenzie. My family has a ranch about 10 miles south of here. I am Standing Bear, war chief of the Chiricahua Apache." The introduction carried weight and dignity despite the man's weakened condition. "Why do you risk helping enemy of your people?" Tommy considered the question seriously, understanding that his answer would be important to this man who held the power of life and death over so many people in the territory. "Because you're not my enemy right now. You're just a man who needed help, and my ma always taught me that helping folks in trouble is the right thing to do, regardless of who they are." Standing Bear's expression showed surprise at the boy's straightforward response. In his experience, white settlers viewed Apache as subhuman threats to be eliminated, rather than fellow human beings deserving of compassion or assistance. "Your mother, she was wise woman. Where is she now?" "Died 3 years ago. Consumption took her during a hard winter." Tommy's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had learned to live with loss. "And your father? He knows you help Apache, chief?" Tommy shook his head. "He's back at the ranch with a bad leg. Doesn't know where I am or what I'm doing. Probably thinks I'm just running the cattle to the regular watering holes." The implications of Tommy's situation weren't lost on Standing Bear. The boy had risked not only his own safety, but potential punishment from his family to help someone his community would consider a mortal enemy. Such actions spoke to character that transcended cultural boundaries. As darkness fell over the hidden canyon, Tommy shared his meager food supplies with Standing Bear, helping the wounded chief drink water and eat enough to maintain his strength. They talked quietly about practical matters, the location of the nearest army patrols, the safest routes through the desert, the recent raids that had inflamed tensions throughout the region. "Tommy Mackenzie," Standing Bear said as the boy prepared to make the journey home in darkness, "you have given me my life when you could have taken it or simply let the desert claim it. This creates obligation, debt that must be repaid." "You don't owe me anything," Tommy replied. "I just did what seemed right. Among my people, such kindness creates sacred bond. You have become, how do you say, under protection of Standing Bear and all who follow him. This I swear by the spirits of my ancestors." Tommy wasn't sure he fully understood the significance of what Standing Bear was telling him, but the solemnity in the chief's voice suggested that something important had just occurred between them. "I'll try to come back tomorrow with better medical supplies," Tommy promised as he mounted Copper for the dangerous ride home. "Try to stay hidden and keep that wound clean." As Tommy disappeared into the darkness, Standing Bear lay back against the rocks and contemplated the remarkable turn his life had taken. He had expected to die alone in the desert, but instead had been saved by a white boy whose simple act of mercy might change the course of the escalating conflict that threatened to consume the entire territory. The sacred bond had been forged, and Standing Bear was a man who honored his obligations, regardless of the consequences. Chapter 3: The Secret Alliance. Tommy returned to the hidden canyon the following evening with medical supplies he'd carefully gathered without arousing his father's suspicion. He'd claimed to be treating a valuable bull that had been injured on the rocks, which explained his need for bandages, antiseptic, and his mother's old medical kit that had been stored in the barn since her death. Standing Bear's condition had improved dramatically overnight, his natural resilience and the boy's basic first aid having stemmed the immediate threat to his life. The Apache chief sat propped against a smooth boulder, alert and obviously planning his next moves with the strategic mind that had made him one of the most respected war leaders in the Southwest. "You came back," Standing Bear observed, as Tommy approached with his supplies. "Many white men would have hoped the desert finished what their bullets started." "I said I'd come back," Tommy replied matter-of-factly, kneeling to examine the wound. "My word means something, same as yours probably does." The chief studied the boy with growing respect, as Tommy worked to change the bandages with surprising skill for someone so young. "You have hands of healer, like Apache medicine man. Your mother teach you this?" "She was the closest thing to a doctor for 50 miles, Tommy explained, carefully cleaning the wound with diluted carbolic acid he'd found in his mother's kit. "Had to learn to patch folks up when they got hurt, whether it was my pa or neighbors or even strangers passing through." Over the next hour, Standing Bear shared information that no white settler had ever heard directly from Apache leadership. He spoke of the increasing pressure from the army, the dwindling water sources that forced his people into desperate raids, and the young warriors who grew more difficult to control as their traditional way of life disappeared. "My people are hungry, boy. Army promises food on reservation, but food is rotten. Blankets are full of disease. We choose to fight rather than die slowly on white man's charity." Tommy listened without judgment, beginning to understand the impossible situation that drove Apache raids, rather than simply condemning them as savage violence. "What about peace? Isn't there some way to work things out?" Standing Bear's laugh held no humor. "White eyes speak of peace while their soldiers hunt us like wolves. They want us to disappear, not live alongside them. But you," he studied Tommy's earnest face, "you are different." "Why?" "Maybe because I see you as a person instead of just an Apache," Tommy replied honestly. "You're hurt. You're worried about your people. You're trying to do what's right for folks who depend on you. That's not so different from what my pa deals with, just on a bigger scale." For 3 days, Tommy continued his secret visits to the hidden canyon, bringing food, medical supplies, and gradually nursing Standing Bear back to full strength. During their conversations, an unlikely friendship developed between the teenage ranch boy and the Apache war chief, a relationship that bridged cultural divides through mutual respect and shared understanding of responsibility. "You should go back to your people soon," Tommy observed on the 4th evening, as he watched Standing Bear test his injured shoulder's range of motion. "They're probably worried sick about you." "Yes, but first, you must understand what this means for your family." Standing Bear's expression grew serious. "War is coming, Tommy Mackenzie. Army has new colonel who believes only dead Apache is good Apache. He will push us until we have no choice but to fight with everything we have." Tommy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert's nighttime temperature. "When?" "Soon. Maybe weeks, maybe days. When it begins, many innocent people will die on both sides. But you and yours, you will be protected. This, I swear." Standing Bear reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a small piece of carved turquoise, shaped like a bear claw and marked with symbols that seemed to shift in the firelight. "You carry this always. Any Apache warrior who sees it will know you are under my protection. Tell your father what you have done, what you have earned. It may save your lives." Tommy accepted the talisman with the gravity appropriate to such a gift, understanding that he held something of immense cultural significance. What if the other warriors don't believe it? What if they think I stole it? They will believe. Standing Bear's voice carried absolute certainty. "This is Chief's mark, blessed by Medicine Man, known to all Chiricahua. No Apache would dare harm bearer of this token, not if they value their standing with the spirits." As Standing Bear prepared to leave the canyon and return to his people, Tommy realized that their brief friendship had forever changed his understanding of the conflict that defined life in the territory. The Apache weren't faceless savages bent on mindless destruction. They were people fighting for survival in an impossible situation, led by men like Standing Bear, who carried the terrible burden of making life and death decisions for their communities. "Will I see you again?" Tommy asked as the chief mounted his restored warhorse. "Perhaps, if the spirits will it, and we both survive what comes next." Standing Bear paused, looking down at the boy who had saved his life. "You have great heart, Tommy Mackenzie. Do not let this war make it smaller." With those words, Standing Bear rode into the darkness, leaving Tommy alone with the weight of knowledge that would soon test everything he believed about courage, loyalty, and the price of doing what was right. Chapter 4. When War Came to the Valley. 6 weeks after Standing Bear's departure, the war he had predicted erupted across the Arizona Territory with devastating fury. Colonel Marcus Brennan, the new military commander at Fort Apache, had implemented what he called a total pacification strategy that treated all Apache as hostile combatants and authorized immediate military action against any Native Americans found off the reservation. The first indication Tommy had that the conflict had begun came when smoke appeared on the southern horizon, the Hendricks Ranch burning after a dawn raid that left 2 settlers dead and their livestock scattered across the desert. Within hours, similar smoke signals marked the destruction of the Martinez homestead and the Walker trading post, creating a chain of devastation that was moving steadily northward toward the Mackenzie Ranch. "Tommy, get inside and help me with the rifles," called his father, James Mackenzie, as he stood on their front porch watching the distant smoke with grim understanding. Despite his injured leg, the elder Mackenzie moved with the efficiency of a man who had survived previous Indian conflicts and understood the deadly seriousness of their situation. "Pa, there's something I need to tell you," Tommy began, fingering the turquoise bear claw that hung hidden beneath his shirt. The time had come to reveal his secret, regardless of the consequences. "Not now, son. We need to prepare for—" "This is about the Apache, Pa. About the raids." Tommy's tone carried such urgency that his father stopped his preparations and looked at him sharply. Over the next 10 minutes, Tommy related the entire story of his encounter with Standing Bear, his decision to save the wounded chief's life, and the protection that had been promised in return. James Mackenzie listened with growing astonishment and alarm, his weathered face cycling through expressions of disbelief, anger, and grudging respect for his son's courage. "Boy, do you have any idea what you've done?" James finally asked, sinking into a chair as the implications of Tommy's story became clear. "You saved the life of one of the most dangerous Apache war chiefs in the territory. Some folks would call that treason, and some folks might call it the reason we're going to live through what's coming," Tommy replied, pulling out the turquoise talisman to show his father. "Standing Bear gave me his word, Pa, his sacred word." Before James could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats sent both men to the windows with rifles ready. What they saw defied every expectation and assumption about Apache warfare tactics. A single Apache warrior rode slowly toward their ranch house, his hands clearly visible and empty of weapons. The man stopped 50 yards from the porch and called out in accented but clear English, "Tommy Mackenzie, I come with words from Standing Bear." Tommy emerged from the house despite his father's protests, the turquoise bear claw prominently displayed on a leather cord around his neck. The Apache warrior's eyes immediately focused on the talisman, and his hostile expression shifted to one of respectful recognition. "I am Running Wolf, war leader under Standing Bear," the warrior announced formally. "My chief sends warning. Army comes with many soldiers. They burn everything, kill all they find. You must leave this place before sun sets, or you will die with your enemies." "What about our neighbors, the other ranchers?" Tommy asked, thinking of the families scattered throughout the valley. Running Wolf's expression remained impassive. "They did not save life of Apache chief. They must take their chances with soldiers or with war parties. But you are under protection. This one time we help you escape what comes." The moral complexity of the situation hit Tommy like a physical blow. Standing Bear's protection would save his family, but only his family. The other settlers, people he'd known his entire life, would face the full fury of Apache vengeance, without any hope of mercy or protection. "Can't you protect them too? If I asked Standing Bear to—" "You do not understand, boy," Running Wolf interrupted. "These people have killed Apache women and children. They have broken treaties, stolen sacred lands, poisoned waterholes. The debt between you and Standing Bear does not extend to your enemies." James Mackenzie joined his son on the porch, leaning heavily on his walking stick, but maintaining the dignity of a man who had faced danger throughout his life. "We appreciate the warning," he said carefully, "but we can't just abandon our neighbors to save ourselves." Running Wolf studied the older Mackenzie with approval. "You are a man of honor like your son. This is good, but you cannot save those who chose war over peace. You can only save yourselves, and only if you leave now." As if summoned by his words, dust clouds appeared on the horizon from two directions, a large contingent of cavalry approaching from the east, and what appeared to be Apache war parties massing to the north and west. The valley was about to become a battlefield, and anyone caught in the middle would likely not survive. "Tommy," James said quietly, "get what you can carry. We're leaving." But as they gathered their most essential possessions, abandoning the ranch that represented their entire life's work, Tommy wrestled with the knowledge that his act of mercy had created an impossible moral situation. He had saved one life and earned protection for his family. But that protection came at the cost of watching his neighbors face destruction without hope of assistance. The turquoise bear claw felt heavy against his chest as they rode away from their home, following Running Wolf toward a hidden trail that would take them safely away from the coming battle. Behind them, smoke began to rise from the valley as two forces prepared to settle their differences with blood and fire. Tommy Mackenzie was learning that even acts of compassion could have consequences that challenged everything a person believed about right and wrong, friendship and loyalty, and the terrible price of survival on the frontier. Chapter 5. The Price of Honor. Final chapter. 2 years had passed since the devastating Battle of Devil's Valley, and the autumn of 1883 found Tommy Mackenzie, now 16, standing on the porch of the new cabin he and his father had built in the safer territory near Tucson. The intervening months had brought an uneasy peace to the Arizona Territory, but the memories of that terrible day when war came to their valley remained etched in Tommy's mind like scars that would never fully heal. The Mackenzies had survived the conflict that destroyed their original ranch, but the cost of their survival weighed heavily on both father and son. Of the 7 families who had lived in Devil's Valley, only 3 had escaped the combined assault of Apache war parties and overzealous cavalry units who treated all civilians as potential enemy collaborators. The Hendricks family had perished in the initial raid, the Martinez homestead had been burned by retreating soldiers, and old Sam Walker had been found dead at his trading post, killed by crossfire between the opposing forces. "Tommy," called his father from inside the cabin, where he was reading a letter that had arrived with the morning mail. "You need to see this." The letter bore the official seal of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and contained news that would once again change the course of Tommy's life. Standing Bear, along with most of his warriors, had been captured after a final desperate battle at Eagle Pass and was now being held at Fort Marion in Florida, awaiting deportation to a reservation in Oklahoma. The Apache resistance in Arizona had finally been broken, and the survivors faced an uncertain future far from their ancestral homeland. "They want me to come to Fort Marion," Tommy said after reading the letter carefully. "Standing Bear asked for me specifically, says he's dying and wants to see me before—" Tommy's voice trailed off as the implications became clear. James Mackenzie studied his son's face, seeing the internal struggle that had defined Tommy's character since that day he chose to save an enemy's life. It's your decision, son, but you should know that going there won't be popular with folks around here. A lot of people still blame the Apache for everything that happened, and they might not understand why you'd want to visit their chief. He saved our lives, Pa. When the war came, his protection was the only reason we survived. Doesn't that mean something? It means everything, Tommy, but not everyone sees it that way. The journey to Fort Marion took 3 weeks, traveling by train through landscapes that seemed peaceful compared to the war-torn territories Tommy had known. When he finally arrived at the fortress where Apache prisoners were held, the sight that greeted him challenged everything he thought he understood about victory and defeat. The proud warriors he remembered from Arizona had been transformed into broken men, wearing ill-fitting military uniforms, their children forced into schools that forbade them from speaking their native language or practicing their traditional customs. Standing Bear, the formidable war chief who had commanded respect and fear across the Southwest, was now a gaunt figure confined to a small cell, dying slowly from tuberculosis and the spiritual defeat that came with watching his people's way of life disappear forever. "Tommy Mackenzie," Standing Bear said when the guards brought Tommy to his cell, his voice barely above a whisper, but still carrying the dignity that had made him a great leader. "You came. I was not certain you would." "I gave you my word," Tommy replied simply, shocked by the chief's deteriorated condition. "Same as you gave me yours." They talked for hours, sometimes in English, sometimes with Standing Bear teaching Tommy basic Apache phrases that allowed them to communicate in the language of his ancestors. The chief spoke of his regrets, not for fighting to defend his people, but for the innocent lives lost on both sides of a conflict that perhaps could have been avoided if more people had possessed Tommy's capacity for seeing beyond cultural boundaries. "The old ways are ending," Standing Bear observed, watching through his cell window as Apache children played in the prison yard, their games a mixture of traditional and American customs. "My grandson will grow up in your world, not mine. But maybe that is not entirely bad thing if there are more white eyes like you." "There could be," Tommy said earnestly. "People just need to see each other as human beings instead of enemies. What you taught me about your people, about why you fought, maybe I could teach that to others." Standing Bear smiled, the first genuine expression of joy Tommy had seen since arriving at the fortress. "You would do this. Speak for Apache when Apache cannot speak for themselves. If you think it would help, if you think it would honor what happened between us." From his medicine pouch, Standing Bear withdrew a second turquoise bear claw, identical to the one Tommy had carried for 2 years. "This was to be my grandson's when he became man, but he will not need it in the world he must live in. You take it. When you speak of Apache, you speak with authority of war chief." The ceremony was simple but profound. Standing Bear placed the second talisman around Tommy's neck while speaking in Apache, the ancient words carrying power that transcended the prison walls and the defeat that surrounded them. Tommy didn't understand all the phrases, but he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a sacred burden. "What do the words mean?" Tommy asked. "They mean you are no longer just friend of Apache. You are brother, keeper of stories, voice for those who cannot speak. It is great honor but also great burden. You must carry truth of what happened here, why we fought, what we lost." Standing Bear died 3 days later, with Tommy holding his hand and speaking the Apache words for safe journey that the chief had taught him. The funeral was a strange mixture of military protocol and whatever traditional elements the prison authorities would permit, but Tommy felt the presence of something larger than the institutional constraints that surrounded them. When Tommy returned to Arizona 6 months later, he carried with him not just the memory of his friendship with Standing Bear, but a mission that would define the rest of his life. He began speaking at churches, schools, and community gatherings, telling the story of his encounter with the Apache chief and what he had learned about the human cost of the frontier wars. The reception was mixed. Some people accused him of being an Indian lover and sympathizer with savages. Others, particularly those who had lost family members in the conflicts, struggled to accept his message of understanding and reconciliation. But gradually his patient testimony began to change minds and open hearts to the possibility that their former enemies had been human beings facing impossible choices, just like themselves. "Tommy," his father observed one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the Arizona mountains in shades of gold and crimson, "your mother would be proud of what you've become. She always said that helping folks in trouble was the most important thing a person could do. Tommy fingered the twin turquoise bear claws that hung around his neck, thinking of Standing Bear and the sacred trust that had been placed in his young hands. "I just hope I'm doing it right, Pa." Carrying his stories, helping people understand what really happened. "You saved a man's life when you were 14 years old," James replied. "Everything that came after, the protection, the friendship, the responsibility you carry now, all of it started with that one choice to help someone who needed it. I'd say you're doing just fine." As the stars emerged over the peaceful valley where they had rebuilt their lives, Tommy Mackenzie reflected on the journey that had taken him from a ranch boy trying to save a wounded stranger to a young man carrying the sacred stories of a vanquished people. The simple act of mercy he had performed in Devil's Canyon had grown into something far larger than he could have imagined, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion could change the world in ways that no amount of warfare ever could. Standing Bear's protection had saved Tommy's life during the war, but Tommy's witness would ensure that Standing Bear's spirit and the truth of his people's struggle would survive long after the last Apache warrior had been forgotten. It was, Tommy thought, a fair exchange between friends who had learned to see beyond the boundaries that divided their worlds.